Master Sergeant Otis Pell had walked condemned men into hearing rooms for 11 years, and he had never once doubted the paper in his hand, until the morning Major Eastonvale called Sergeant Soledad Farrow a killer to her face, and she did not blink. She stood at the small table in her service uniform, 3 years of brig-issue discipline pressed into every seam, hands folded, eyes level on a point just past the board chair's shoulder. Behind the long table, the parole board's 3 officers waited with the patience of people who had already decided. Vale stood at the lectern in dress greens, a folder under his arm he never bothered to open. This is the Marine who got 4 men killed at Thornridge because she wouldn't follow a withdrawal order, he said, and let the silence after it do the rest of his work. I recommend the board deny parole and let the record stand as written. The board chair, a colonel with reading glasses low on her nose, looked over them at Farrow. Sergeant, anything to say for yourself before we vote? Pell had heard that question put to 40 Marines in this room. Most flinched at it, even the innocent ones, because 3 years in a brig taught a person to flinch on schedule. Farrow didn't. Yes, ma'am, she said. Pull the beacon. The colonel frowned. The what? My team lead positioning beacon. Logged into evidence after the inquiry, never opened since. The case file used it to confirm where I was standing when the strike hit. Nobody ever pulled the route data inside it. I'm asking the board to. Vale's mouth twitched, something between amusement and warning. Ma'am, with respect, we don't need a treasure hunt 3 years after the fact. The record is the record. The record, Farrow said, quiet enough that the room had to lean toward her to hear it, was written by the man standing at that lectern. Nobody moved for a second. Pell felt something shift low in his chest that he hadn't felt once in 3 years of standing post over this woman. Not doubt in the file. Not yet, but doubt in himself, for never once having asked a question she just asked out loud in front of a board that could still say no. The colonel was already shaking her head. Procedure didn't run on hunches. In a beacon log 3 years, cold wasn't on anyone's docket, when a voice cracked from the back row of folding chairs reserved for character witnesses who almost never spoke. I'll tell you what's on it. Every head in the room turned. Pell had logged the man's name at the door that morning as a character reference, the kind who signed in, sat quiet, and left without saying a word, the way character references almost always did. Dale Roan stood up slowly. 29 years old, a civilian now, a windbreaker over a collared shirt he'd clearly bought for this, hands shaking at his sides in a way 3 years of silence hadn't managed to fix. Sergeant, the colonel said, you weren't called to testify. I drove 6 hours, Roan said. I'm testifying. Vale's jaw set hard. This man wasn't even cleared to address the board. He was at Thornridge, Farrow said, the first thing she'd offered without being asked. He's the only one of us who came home standing on his own legs. The colonel weighed that for a long moment, then gave one short nod. Go ahead, son. The board will hear it. Roan didn't sit to do it. He stood the way men stand when they've rehearsed a thing in their heads for 3 years and never once had anywhere to put it down. The major's withdrawal order came over the net at 0412, he said. Sent us down the wash, low ground, fastest line back to the LZ. Sergeant Farrow held the team up, argued it on the radio, said the wash was a kill box waiting to happen. The major repeated the order. She redirected us to the high ground instead. Against the order, yeah, that part of the file's true. She'll tell you herself it's true. He stopped, breathing through something old and unfinished. What's not in the file is that the wash got hit 4 minutes after the major's order went out over the net. Mortars walked in close. If we'd gone where he sent us, all 4 of us die in that wash together. Instead, 3 of us are standing here today because she didn't go where she was told. Pell's pen had stopped moving against the legal pad sometime in the last half minute without his noticing. 4 men died. Vale said, sharper now, color rising in his neck. And no amount of hero worship from a grateful survivor changes that fact for this board. 1 man died. Roan said, turning to face him for the first time since he'd stood up. Corporal Cabrera, on the ridge, covering our extraction after Sergeant Farrow sent the rest of us down with the wounded and stayed up top alone to keep eyes on the landing zone until the birds were wheels down. That's not 4 men lost to disobedience, Major. That's 1 man and her, buying 4 minutes for 3 of us to live, after your order would have buried all 4 of us in that wash before she ever broke radio silence to refuse it. The room had gone the particular kind of quiet Pell associated with verdicts, not arguments, the quiet that comes after, not during. The colonel looked past Vale to Pell. Master Sergeant. The locker. He was already moving before she'd finished the sentence. It took him 4 minutes to walk the property room, sign the chain of custody log a second time in 3 years, and carry the small olive drab beacon back into the hearing room, cradled in both hands like it weighed more than it did. He set it into the reader port. The facility's IT specialist kept charge for exactly this kind of request, and nobody had used since the day the case first closed. And the screen on the wall woke up in a column of timestamps nobody in that room had ever been clear to see. 0412. Withdrawal order received. Transmitted by Maj Vale. 0413. Pharaoh refuses. Requests alternate route denied. 0414. Pharaoh redirects team to high ground. 0416. Mortar strike logged. Grid coordinates match ordered route. 0431. Pharaoh transmits medevac grid. Holds ridge position alone. 0447. Medevac wheels down. 3 extracted. The colonel read it once, then a second time, slower. When she looked up, it wasn't at Pharaoh. Major, your order is time-stamped 4 minutes before the mortar strike that hit the exact route you sent them down. Sergeant Pharaoh's refusal is time-stamped 1 minute after your order, before the strike landed, not after it. She didn't get lucky disobeying you. She read that ground better than you did, in real time, with a radio in one hand and 3 men's lives in the other. And then she held a ridge alone to make sure the bill for it came out of her, not them. Vale opened his mouth. Nothing came out of it for a long moment. He looked, for the first time in 3 years of Pell watching officers give statements at that lectern, like a man discovering the floor he'd been standing on had never actually been there. I had reason to believe at the time, he started. You had a report due, the colonel said, not unkindly, which somehow made it land harder, and a sergeant whose actual conduct would have made yours look slow if you'd written it straight. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Beside her, the other 2 board members were already flipping their own copies of the file back to the conviction page, the way men check a bridge they'd just been told is condemned. Pell stood at the side of the room, where he'd stood for 3 years of these hearings, and for the first time in any of them, he came to attention without being told to. He didn't fully understand why his body did it before the vote was even called. It simply seemed like the only correct thing left to do with his hands. The colonel didn't call a recess. She didn't need one. The board finds the original conviction record materially incomplete, she said. Recommendation: immediate exoneration, full restoration of rank, and referral of the original investigating officer's report for separate review. She looked at Pharaoh, then the way a person looks at a Marine instead of a case file. Staff Sergeant Pharaoh, as of this hearing, is there a call sign on record this board should restore alongside your rank? Last watched, ma'am, Pharaoh said. Force Recon never let it lapse. Said it'd be waiting. Then let the record show it was waiting for good reason. The colonel closed her folder. Staff Sergeant, welcome back. It was Roan who broke first, not Pharaoh. 3 years of carrying a story nobody had asked him to tell finally setting itself down somewhere it could be believed. Pharaoh crossed the room and put a hand on his shoulder, and for a moment neither of them said anything that needed saying out loud. Vale was still standing at the lectern, the folder under his arm meaning nothing now, when Pell walked past him to see Pharaoh out. Not at the careful 3 paces he'd kept behind her for 3 years, but beside her, the way an honor guard walked beside someone instead of behind them. 3 years, Pell said quietly, the first words he'd ever spoken to her as something other than her custodian, and I never once thought to ask about that beacon. Most people don't ask, Pharaoh said. They just decide. He thought about that the rest of the day and most days after. He had read her file 100 times in 3 years and never once read the woman standing inside it. And the thing he carried out of that hearing room wasn't the relief of a verdict overturned. It was the plainer, harder lesson that a man could wear the uniform of justice for 11 years and still need someone braver than him to ask for the one piece of evidence he had never once thought to pull.